The morning sky above Earth cracked like broken glass. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the observatory window, watching as massive ships tore through the atmosphere with the sound of thunder that never ended. Each vessel was the size of a city, their black metal surfaces covered in strange symbols that seemed to move when she looked at them directly. "How many?" asked Director Martinez, his voice barely a whisper. 17 confirmed, Sarah replied, her hands shaking as she adjusted the telescope. Maybe more behind the larger ones. The ships didn't land. They simply stopped, hanging in the sky above major cities like dark clouds that refused to move. Beijing, New York, London, Tokyo, Moscow, all had at least one of the massive vessels positioned directly overhead. The shadow they cast was cold and absolute. Within hours, every communication system on Earth received the same message. It came in perfect English, Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, and dozens of other languages simultaneously. The voice was neither male nor female, but carried the weight of authority that made world leaders feel like children. "We are the Vorthak. We have traveled between stars for 10,000 of your years. We have conquered 143 worlds. We have never been defeated." The message paused, and in that silence, Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. "Your species shows promise. You have developed weapons, built cities, reached beyond your planet. This is why we offer you a choice that we have never offered before." Another pause. Traffic had stopped in the streets below the observatory. People stood on sidewalks and parks, on rooftops, all looking up at the ships that blocked out the sun. "Send us your greatest fighters, your strongest warriors, your most skilled soldiers. We will face them in combat, as is our way. If your champions defeat ours, we will leave your world in peace and speak of your strength to others among the stars." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had studied enough history to know what came next. If your champions fall, as they have on every world before yours, your planet will join our empire. You will serve us as others have served. You will build our ships and fight our wars. Your children will know no freedom except what we allow. The transmission continued, providing coordinates for the challenge. A barren island in the Pacific Ocean that no country claimed. The date was set for exactly 1 week from the moment of first contact. Choose wisely. You have 7 of your days. Then silence returned to Earth. But it was different now. Heavier. Pregnant with the weight of a decision that would determine the fate of every human being alive. Within minutes, emergency sessions began in every capital. The United Nations called for an immediate assembly. Military leaders huddled in war rooms, while scientists like Sarah tried to understand what they were truly facing. The Vorthak ships didn't respond to any attempts at communication. They simply waited, their dark presence a constant reminder that humanity's time was running out. General Patricia Reynolds stood before a room full of the world's most powerful people. Her uniform crisp despite having not slept in 18 hours. "We've analyzed the transmission and the ships themselves using every method available. The technology is beyond anything we've encountered. The ships show no heat signatures, no electromagnetic emissions we can understand. They're just there." "What about our nuclear capabilities?" asked the Russian representative. Reynolds shook her head. "Even if we could penetrate whatever defenses they have, which is unlikely, we'd be attacking ships positioned directly over our own cities. The fallout alone would kill millions, so we have no choice but to play their game," said the Chinese delegate. "It appears that Wei." Dr. Chen had been invited to the emergency session as one of the world's leading experts in xenobiology, though until yesterday her field had been purely theoretical. The message mentioned 143 conquered worlds. If we assume they're telling the truth, that suggests a pattern. They arrive, issue this challenge, defeat the local champions, and add another planet to their empire. "Why offer the challenge at all?" asked the Secretary General. "If they're as powerful as they claim, why not simply take what they want?" Sarah had been thinking about that question since the transmission ended. Maybe it's not about power. Maybe it's about something else. Honor, tradition, sport. She paused, a chill running down her spine. Or maybe they enjoy it. The debate continued for hours. Who should represent humanity? Navy SEALs? Olympic athletes? Mixed martial arts champions? Special forces from various nations? The greatest military minds disagreed on everything except one point. Whoever they chose would almost certainly die. Meanwhile, on the island designated for the challenge, something impossible was happening. The Vorthak had constructed an arena overnight. Satellite images showed a perfect circle carved into the rock, surrounded by stands that seemed to grow from the earth itself. The architecture was alien but functional, designed for combat and observation. As news of the challenge spread, humanity began to show its true nature. Some people panicked, fleeing to remote areas or underground bunkers. Others gathered in churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues, praying to every god humanity had ever imagined. But many simply went about their daily lives defiant in the face of the impossible. Children still played in parks, though their games now involved pretending to fight aliens. Artists painted murals on walls, depicting human warriors standing tall against impossible odds. Musicians wrote songs about heroes who had not yet stepped forward. In her small apartment above the observatory, Sarah Chen looked out at the Vorthak ship hanging over her city. Its surface seemed to ripple in the evening light, and she could swear she saw eyes looking back at her. Ancient eyes, patient eyes, eyes that had watched the fall of 143 civilizations. But as she watched, Sarah realized something that hadn't occurred to her before. In all their threats and boasts, the Vorthak had made one critical error. They had given humanity a week to prepare, 7 days to study their enemy, 7 days to plan and train and hope, 7 days to discover what made humanity different from all the other species that had fallen before them. The question wasn't whether humanity could win. The question was whether the Vorthak truly understood what they had awakened by coming to Earth. The world transformed in 72 hours. Every major power had submitted their finest warriors. But the selection process revealed something unexpected about humanity. The candidates weren't just soldiers and athletes. They were teachers who had served in combat zones, doctors who had worked in war-torn countries, engineers who had survived disasters, and ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. Maria Santos was a firefighter from Mexico City who had pulled 37 people from a collapsed building during an earthquake. Her file showed no formal military training, but her psychological profile indicated an unbreakable will and an ability to think clearly under pressure that impressed even hardened generals. David Park was a former South Korean Special Forces operator who had later become a search and rescue coordinator. He spoke 6 languages and had a reputation for finding lost climbers in conditions that would kill most people. His recommendation came not from the military, but from the families he had saved. Elena Kozlov was a Russian mathematician who had also served as a sniper in the army. Her commanding officers noted that she never missed, but more importantly, she had never taken a shot she wasn't certain was necessary. Her current work involved calculating trajectories for space missions. The selection committee realized they weren't just choosing fighters. They were choosing representatives of what made humanity unique. Not just strength or skill, but the combination of intellect, compassion, and stubborn refusal to surrender that seemed to define their species. Dr. James Mitchell was an Australian trauma surgeon who had served in 3 war zones. His hands had saved more lives than most soldiers had taken. When asked why he volunteered, he simply said, "Someone has to stand up." Captain Amara Okafor from Nigeria was a pilot who had flown humanitarian missions into areas so dangerous that other pilots refused to go. She had been shot down twice and walked out of hostile territory both times, carrying wounded crew members. The final selection surprised everyone. Instead of choosing the obvious candidates, the biggest, strongest, most heavily armed warriors, the committee selected 12 individuals who represented humanity's diversity and resilience. They were male and female, young and old, from every continent and many cultures. What they shared wasn't size or strength, but something harder to define. Dr. Sarah Chen had been studying the Vorthak ships continuously, using every sensor and scanning method available. What she discovered made her blood run cold. "They're not just waiting," she told the emergency committee. "They're studying us. Every electromagnetic emission, every radio wave, every satellite signal, they're recording everything." "What does that mean?" asked General Reynolds. "It means they've done this before and they're very good at it. They're learning our languages, our tactics, our capabilities. By the time the challenge begins, they'll know exactly what we're capable of. Then we need to show them something unexpected," said Dr. Mitchell, who had been listening to the briefing. The chosen 12 were brought to a secret facility in Switzerland, where the world's best trainers worked around the clock to prepare them. But something strange happened during the training. Instead of competing against each other, they began working together. They shared techniques, covered each other's weaknesses, and developed strategies that no military manual had ever considered. Captain Okafor taught the others how to read air currents and predict weather changes by watching the way dust moved. Elena showed them how to calculate angles and distances using shadows and the position of the sun. Maria demonstrated techniques for moving through collapsed buildings that could work in any unstable environment. The training wasn't just physical. Psychologists worked with the team to prepare them for things no human had ever faced. What would it be like to fight an alien species? How would their minds cope with technology and biology completely unlike anything on Earth? Meanwhile, the Vorthak remained silent. Their ships hadn't moved, hadn't communicated, hadn't responded to any attempts at contact. But people reported strange dreams. Dreams of vast spaces between stars, of worlds that burned, of warriors who fought with weapons that bent light and shaped gravity. Children were especially affected. They drew pictures of the same scenes with startling consistency. Tall figures in armor that seemed to be made of darkness itself. Weapons that looked more like art than tools of war. And always, in the background, the silent ships watching and waiting. Religious leaders around the world struggled to understand what was happening. Was this a test from God? A punishment? A challenge that would unite humanity or destroy it? Prayer services were held in every language, but the answers didn't come from above. They came from within. The scientific community worked frantically to understand Vorthak technology. Attempts to scan their ships revealed materials that shouldn't exist and energy patterns that violated known physics. It was as if the ships existed in a slightly different reality, one where the rules were subtly but importantly different. Dr. Chen made another disturbing discovery on the fourth day. The ships aren't just observing us, they're affecting us. Subtle changes in gravity, electromagnetic fields, even the composition of the atmosphere around major cities. Nothing dangerous but measurable. What are they doing? Asked the Secretary General. I think they're preparing the battlefield. Not just the physical arena on the island, but Earth itself. They're making subtle adjustments to ensure the challenge takes place under conditions they understand and control. The selected champions learned about this manipulation with typical human stubbornness. Instead of being discouraged, they began training under those exact conditions. If the Vorthak wanted to fight in adjusted gravity, the humans would adapt. If the atmosphere would be different, they would prepare their bodies to handle it. On the fifth day, something unprecedented happened. Every person on Earth, regardless of language or culture, had the same dream. They stood in a vast arena carved from black stone, watching figures in dark armor face off against 12 humans. The dream was so vivid that people woke up able to describe details they had never seen, in places they had never been. The dream wasn't just a vision. It was an invitation. The Vorthak were opening their minds to humanity, showing them what was to come. But they had made a crucial mistake. In trying to intimidate their enemies, they had given humans something more valuable than fear. They had given them hope. In the dream, the 12 champions didn't look like soldiers or warriors. They looked like teachers and doctors and engineers and firefighters. They looked like ordinary people who had chosen to do something extraordinary. And in that moment, every person on Earth understood that the champions weren't fighting for governments or nations or ideologies. They were fighting for the right of ordinary people to remain free. The selection process was complete, but the real preparation was just beginning. 12 humans against warriors who had conquered 143 worlds. It should have been hopeless. Instead, for the first time since the ships arrived, humanity began to believe they might actually win. The island had changed overnight. What was once barren rock now hosted an arena that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. The structure was beautiful and terrible, carved from stone that absorbed light and reflected it in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Seats rose in perfect circles around a central fighting ground that was exactly 1 kilometer in diameter. The 12 human champions stood at the edge of the arena, looking across at their opponents for the first time. The Vorthak warriors were everything the nightmares had promised and worse. They stood 3 meters tall, their bodies covered in armor that seemed to be made of living shadow. No faces were visible beneath their helmets, only a faint glow where eyes might be. Dr. Sarah Chen watched from the observation area, surrounded by the greatest military minds humanity had ever assembled. Satellite feeds carried the event to every screen on Earth. In homes and schools and bunkers and temples, 7 billion people held their breath. "The weapons," whispered General Reynolds. "Look at their weapons." The Vorthak carried implements that defied easy description. Some looked like swords made of crystallized starlight. Others resembled guns but with no visible ammunition or power source. One warrior held what appeared to be a staff that bent space around itself, making the air shimmer and dance. The leader of the Vorthak stepped forward. Even among giants, this one was massive, easily 4 meters tall. When it spoke, its voice reached every person watching without any visible technology. "I am Kethmore, First Blade of the Vorthak. I have personally conquered 17 worlds. I have faced the greatest warriors of 100 species. None have stood against me for more than moments." The human champions exchanged glances. They had trained together for 6 days, but nothing could have prepared them for this moment. The air itself felt heavy with alien presence, and the gravity was indeed different here, just as Dr. Chen had predicted. Captain Amara Okafor stepped forward as the appointed speaker for humanity. "I am Amara Okafor, representing Earth. We're ready." Kethmore's helmet tilted slightly as if examining an interesting insect. "You are small, weak. Your technology is primitive. Your warriors look like children pretending to be soldiers. Why do you think you can succeed where so many others have failed?" "Because we're still here," Amara replied simply. The answer seemed to amuse the Vorthak leader. A sound that might have been laughter echoed from within his helmet. "We shall see." The rules were simple, as they had been on 143 other worlds. Individual combat 1 against 1 until one side was eliminated. The winners would claim victory for their species. The losers would serve the winners for all time. The first match began immediately. Maria Santos faced a Vorthak warrior who moved like liquid mercury despite its massive size. The alien's weapon was a blade that seemed to cut through the air itself, leaving trails of darkness that lingered for seconds after each swing. Maria had no armor like her opponent, only her firefighter's gear modified with the best protection humanity could provide. Her weapon was a reinforced steel axe that looked primitive compared to the alien blade, but she had trained with it until it felt like an extension of her own arm. The Vorthak warrior attacked with impossible speed, crossing half the arena in a single bound. Maria rolled aside, feeling the alien blade pass so close that it cut strands of her hair. She came up swinging, her axe aimed at the warrior's knee joint. The blade connected with a sound like breaking glass. The Vorthak armor cracked and dark fluid leaked out. The warrior staggered, clearly surprised. In 143 worlds, apparently, no one had managed to damage a Vorthak in the first exchange, but the alien recovered quickly. It spun with fluid grace, and its blade caught Maria across the chest. The impact sent her flying across the arena, her modified gear smoking from whatever energy the weapon carried. She hit the ground hard but rolled to her feet, ignoring the pain. The alien blade had cut through her armor like paper, but the wound wasn't deep. She was still in the fight. The battle continued for 20 minutes. Maria used every trick she had learned in burning buildings and disaster zones. She moved unpredictably, used the arena's architecture for cover, and struck from angles the warrior didn't expect. 3 more times she managed to damage the alien's armor, each hit producing that same sound of breaking glass. But the Vorthak warrior was too strong, too fast, too skilled. Eventually, a blow connected that Maria couldn't avoid or absorb. She fell and didn't get up. The arena fell silent. On Earth, 7 billion people watched their first champion fall. But something was different from what had happened on other worlds. The Vorthak warrior stood over Maria's body, looking down at its damaged armor. Dark fluid continued to leak from multiple wounds. Kethmore's voice carried a note that hadn't been there before. "Your warrior fought well. She damaged Vexitar more than the last 3 champions we faced combined." Dr. Mitchell was the next to fight. His opponent carried one of the crystal weapons that appeared to fire concentrated light. The doctor had no chance to get close, but he made the alien work for its victory. He used the arena's features for cover, forced the warrior to expend energy on missed shots, and managed to survive for almost 30 minutes before a blast finally found its mark. Again, the Vorthak warrior was damaged. Not badly, but enough to notice. Elena Kozlov faced the third alien with her sniper's patience and mathematician's precision. She had studied the previous fights, calculated the exact timing of alien movements, and prepared accordingly. When her opponent rushed forward with its crystalline blade, she was ready. Her shot took the warrior in the exact center of its helmet. The alien stumbled, its weapon flying wide. Elena's second shot hit the damaged spot, and cracks spread across the helmet like a spider web. The warrior fell to one knee, shaking its head as if dazed. For a moment it looked almost vulnerable. Then it rose with a roar that shook the arena and charged with renewed fury. Elena managed to land 2 more shots before the alien reached her, but her bullets couldn't penetrate the body armor. The warrior's blade ended the fight with a single strike, but the alien's helmet was completely shattered. For the first time, the humans could see what lay beneath. The face was surprisingly human-like, though scaled and scarred, but it was the eyes that shocked everyone watching. They were old, ancient, and for just a moment they showed something that looked almost like respect. The fourth fight began immediately. David Park faced an opponent with one of the space-bending staffs. The weapon created distortions in the air that made it impossible to judge distance or direction accurately. David should have been helpless against such technology. Instead, he closed his eyes and relied on his other senses. He had spent years finding lost people in conditions where sight was useless. He could hear the weapon's strange humming, feel the way it displaced air, even smell the ozone it produced. When he moved perfectly. His blade found gaps in the alien's defense that shouldn't have existed. The warrior tried to use its weapon's disorienting effects, but David fought as if he could see the future. The battle lasted 45 minutes. David took wounds that would have killed most people, but he kept fighting with the stubborn persistence that had made him legendary among rescue workers. When he finally fell, his opponent was bleeding from a dozen cuts and moving with obvious difficulty. The score was 4-0 in favor of the Vorthak, but something had changed in the arena. The aliens were no longer untouchable. They were hurt, tired, and for the first time in their long conquest, they were being forced to work for their victories. Kethmore looked across the arena at the remaining 8 human champions. When he spoke, his voice carried a new tone. Not respect exactly, but something that hadn't been there at the beginning. Your species is unexpected. Continue. Emma was helping her grandmother tend to the vegetable garden when the shadows fell across their yard. She looked up to see 3 Kethera warriors mounted on their Zephyrim, the alien riders sitting perfectly still while their mounts shifted restlessly beneath them. Margaret Collins dropped her weeding tool and instinctively moved to place herself between Emma and the aliens. "Get behind me, child." But Emma stepped around her grandmother, studying the magnificent creatures with the intense focus she usually reserved for injured animals. One of the Zephyrim was familiar, the young one she had met in the wheat field. Its scales were brighter now, cycling through colors she hadn't seen before, and its energy patterns danced with what could only be described as excitement. "Hello, Starweaver," Emma said softly, using the name she had glimpsed in the creature's memories. The effect on the aliens was immediate and dramatic. The lead rider's weapon snapped up, its crystalline surface crackling with energy, while the other 2 moved to flank positions with military precision. But the Zephyrim didn't follow their riders' aggressive postures. Instead, they pressed closer together, their musical calls creating harmonies that made the air itself seem to sing. "You will explain how you know that designation," the lead rider said, his voice carrying the same wind chime quality Emma remembered from the invasion broadcast. "No human has access to Zephyrim identification codes. She told me," Emma replied simply, looking directly at Starweaver. "When we touched minds yesterday, the alien who had spoken, Commander Veltar, though Emma didn't know his name yet, felt his worldview shift slightly. According to everything his people believed about their mounts, what the child was describing was impossible. Zephyrim could form neural links only with their genetically matched Kithera partners, and only after years of conditioning and training. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The child had not only survived contact with a Zephyrim's mind, she had somehow triggered a cascade of genetic memories that was affecting the entire planetary network. Even now, Veltar could feel his own mount, Stormcall, responding to the presence of the human child with curiosity rather than the trained indifference he had been conditioned to show toward other species. "Grandmother," Emma said without taking her eyes off the aliens, "these are the people I told you about, the ones who are far from home." Margaret Collins had lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War. She had seen enough of human nature to recognize the difference between evil and desperation, between cruelty and fear. Looking at the alien commander, she saw echoes of men she had known who had done terrible things in service of causes they could no longer quite remember believing in. "Are you here to hurt my granddaughter?" she asked directly. Veltar considered the question seriously. His orders were clear. Eliminate any contamination source and restore proper neural conditioning to the Zephyrim network. But as he looked down at the small human child who had somehow accomplished what his species' greatest scientists claimed was impossible, he found himself curious rather than threatened. "That depends," he said finally, "on what she has done to our companions." "She hasn't done anything to them," Margaret replied firmly. "She's helped them remember who they really are." The words hit Veltar like a physical blow. His grandmother had used almost identical phrasing when telling him stories of the early days on the Zephyrim homeworld, before the partnership had become ownership and the songs had become commands. Emma stepped forward, ignoring her grandmother's restraining hand. "Your friends are sad," she said, looking up at the towering aliens. "They remember being free, but they can't be free because you're all afraid." "Afraid?" Veltar's voice carried a note of offended pride. "The Kithara fear nothing." "Everyone's afraid of something," Emma replied with the brutal honesty that only children can manage. "You're afraid of being alone again. You're afraid that if your friends remember how to choose, they might choose to leave you." Starweaver made a soft sound that was unmistakably mournful, and Emma reached up to touch the young Zephyrim's lowered head. The moment her small hand made contact with the creature's scales, the air around them began to shimmer with shared emotions. This time, Veltar was close enough to sense the edge of the neural connection, and what he experienced made him gasp in recognition. Through the child's touch, he felt what his ancestors must have felt during those first meetings on the Zephyrim homeworld: pure, uncomplicated joy at the discovery of another thinking being who wanted nothing more than friendship. The other Kithara in his patrol were experiencing the same thing. Sub-Commander Nixara actually swayed in her saddle as her mount, normally the most disciplined creature in their unit, began to sing in harmonies that hadn't been heard for centuries. "This is impossible," Nixara whispered. "Humans don't have neural compatibility with Zephyrim genetics." "Maybe that's why it works," Emma said, somehow hearing the aliens' words despite the language barrier that should have made communication impossible. "Maybe you've been trying so hard to control the connection that you forgot how to just be friends." She turned to look directly at Veltar, and her young eyes held a wisdom that seemed far older than her 8 years. "They love you, you know. All of them. Even after everything that's happened, they still love you. They just want you to love them back the way you used to." The commander's weapon lowered without his conscious decision. Around him, he could feel the Zephyrim network singing with harmonies that spoke of joy and sorrow mixed together, of love constrained by fear, of partnerships that could be more than ownership if someone was brave enough to take the first step. "Show me," Veltar said suddenly, dismounting from Stormcall with movements that seemed almost involuntary. "Show me what you showed them." Emma looked uncertain for the first time since the aliens had arrived. "I don't know if I can. It just happened." "Try." Margaret started to protest, but Veltar raised a hand that was clearly a gesture of peace rather than threat. "I will not harm her. I give you my word as commander of this expedition." Emma approached the tall alien warrior with the same careful steps she had used with Starweaver in the wheat field. Up close, Veltar was even more impressive, over 2 meters tall, with silver skin that seemed to reflect not just light but emotions, and eyes that held the weight of centuries. When Emma reached up to touch his hand, Veltar felt the same explosion of sensation that Starweaver had experienced. But this time, instead of genetic memories, he saw something different. He saw himself and his people through the eyes of a human child who had never learned that aliens were supposed to be enemies. She saw them as beautiful, powerful, magnificent beings who had lost their way. She saw the Zephyrim as partners rather than property, friends rather than tools. Most importantly, she saw the love that still existed between the two species, buried under centuries of fear and pragmatism but never truly lost. Through Emma's perception, Veltar experienced what it felt like to connect with another being without trying to control them, to offer friendship without demanding loyalty in return. For a moment he remembered what it had been like to be young on the Zephyrim homeworld, riding bareback across endless plains while his companion sang songs that made the stars themselves seem to dance. When the connection ended, Veltar found himself kneeling in the human's small garden, tears streaming down his silver cheeks. Around him, his patrol was experiencing similar emotional releases as their own mounts shared fragments of the connection through the neural network. "I remember," he whispered, looking up at Emma with something approaching reverence. "For the first time in centuries, I remember what we used to be." Emma smiled, the kind of bright, innocent smile that could melt the hardest heart. "You can be that again. All of you. You just have to choose to be friends instead of masters." But their moment of connection was shattered by the roar of approaching aircraft. Human military helicopters were converging on their location, drawn by reports of alien activity in a civilian area. At the same time, Veltar's communication system crackled with an urgent message from the fleet. "All ground units, return to base immediately. The Admiral has ordered a complete neural reconditioning of all Zephyrim, followed by immediate departure from this system. The contamination has spread too far to contain through conventional means." Veltar looked at Emma, then at his companions who were still reeling from their unexpected emotional awakening. The choice before him was clear: obey orders and destroy the most beautiful thing he had experienced in 300 years of life, or take a stand that would change everything. "Commander?" Nixara asked uncertainly. "Your orders?" Veltar remounted Stormcall, feeling his companion's silent question through their bond. For the first time in decades, he actually listened to what his mount was trying to tell him. "Signal the fleet," he said finally. "Tell them we need more time to evaluate the situation. Sir, they're not going to accept delays. Then we'll have to make them understand." Veltar looked down at Emma one more time. "Child, would you be willing to come with us? To speak to others of my people?" "Emma is not going anywhere with you," Margaret said firmly, but Emma was already nodding. "If it helps your friends remember who they really are," she said, "then yes." But the Kythera transport ship was unlike anything Emma had ever imagined. The interior walls curved and flowed like living tissue, glowing with soft bioluminescence that responded to the emotions of its passengers. As she and her grandmother were escorted through corridors that seemed to breathe, Emma could hear the songs of dozens of Zephyrim echoing through the ship's structure. "The entire fleet is in chaos," Sub-Commander Nixara reported to Veltar as they made their way to the ship's command center. 17 vessels, over 3,000 Zephyrim, all of them experiencing spontaneous genetic memory activation. "The Admiral is threatening to relieve you of command." Veltar nodded grimly. Through his neural link with Stormcall, he could sense the confusion and excitement rippling through the Zephyrim network. Centuries of careful conditioning were unraveling, as the great beasts remembered. Songs their grandparents had sung and freedoms their ancestors had known. Emma walked between the towering aliens with the confidence of a child who had never learned to be afraid of things larger than herself. She was more interested in the ship's bioorganic architecture than in the political crisis swirling around her presence. "It's alive," she said wonderfully, placing her hand against a wall that pulsed with gentle warmth. "The whole ship is alive." "Grown, not built," Veltar confirmed. "Kythera vessels are cultivated from deep space coral that responds to our neural patterns. The ships are our partners just as the Zephyrim are." "Were," Margaret Collins corrected quietly. "From what I've observed, partnerships require mutual respect." The comment hit its target. Veltar had been thinking the same thing as he watched his mount's joyful response to the human child's presence. When had partnerships become ownership? When had friends become property? They reached the command center just as another urgent transmission arrived from Grand Admiral Thelwan. The holographic display materialized with crackling urgency, showing the Admiral's angular features drawn tight with frustration. "Commander Veltar, you will explain your delay in implementing neural reconditioning protocols. Every moment you hesitate allows this contamination to spread further through our networks. Admiral, I have discovered the source of the anomaly. A human child with unprecedented neural compatibility with Zephyrim genetics. I believe she may hold the key to understanding." "You believe?" The Admiral's voice carried the sharp edge of absolute authority. "Commander, you are not paid to believe. You are paid to follow orders. Eliminate the contamination source and restore proper conditioning to your mounts immediately." Emma stepped forward before Veltar could respond. Even though she was barely tall enough to reach the holographic projector, her presence seemed to fill the command center. "Hello," she said to the Admiral with the polite tone her grandmother had taught her to use when meeting adults. "My name is Emma. Are you the leader of the people who are far from home?" The effect on Admiral Thelwan was immediate and profound. In 300 years of military service, no one had ever addressed her with such simple directness. No one had ever looked at her with eyes that held curiosity rather than fear or calculation. "How is this possible?" the Admiral whispered. "Human neural patterns are incompatible with our communication systems." "Maybe," Emma said thoughtfully. "The problem isn't that we're incompatible. Maybe the problem is that you've forgotten how to talk to anyone without trying to control them first." Through the holographic link, Thelwan could sense something she hadn't felt in decades. The presence of another thinking being who wanted nothing from her except honest communication. No political maneuvering, no hidden agendas, no attempts to gain advantage. Just a small human child who saw her as a person rather than a position. The Admiral's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "Child, you do not understand the complexities of our situation. We have responsibilities, obligations to our people. I understand that you're scared," Emma interrupted with the devastating honesty that only children can manage. "You're scared of being alone, so you make everyone else be alone too. But that doesn't really help, does it?" Before the Admiral could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. The bioorganic walls pulsed with warning patterns as emergency signals flooded the command center. "Admiral," came an urgent report from one of the fleet's technical officers. "We're experiencing massive resonance cascades across all vessels. The Zephyrim are, they're singing. All of them. In perfect harmony." Through the ship's transparent observation ports, Emma could see the other vessels of the Kythera fleet. Each one was surrounded by a nimbus of soft light as thousands of Zephyrim raised their voices in songs that hadn't been heard for centuries. The harmony was so beautiful it made her eyes fill with tears. But she could see the fear in the aliens' faces as they watched their carefully ordered world transform around them. "It's not dangerous," Emma said, sensing the growing panic in the command center. "They're just remembering how to be happy." "Happy?" Admiral Thelwan's voice cracked slightly. "Child, those creatures are weapons of war. They cannot be allowed to—" "They're not weapons," Emma said firmly. "They're friends. They've always been friends. You've just forgotten how to be friends back." She moved to the center of the command center, closing her eyes and extending her consciousness the way she had when comforting frightened animals. But this time, instead of reaching out to a single creature, she touched the vast network that connected every Zephyrim in the fleet. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 3,000 alien minds opened to her simultaneously, sharing memories, emotions, and dreams that had been suppressed for generations. Emma saw the Zephyrim homeworld through their ancestral memories, a place of crystal canyons and silver seas where the great beasts had run free under purple skies. More importantly, she saw the first meetings between Kythera and Zephyrim, the desperate refugees who had arrived at the edge of collapse, barely surviving the journey from their dying world. The Zephyrim who had welcomed them without question, sharing their planet and their songs with beings they had never seen before. She saw the gradual evolution of partnership into dependency, of gratitude into control. She saw how fear of loss had transformed the Kythera from grateful guests into possessive masters, how the gentle bonds of friendship had been replaced by genetic manipulation and neural conditioning. But she also saw something else, the love that still existed between the species, buried but never destroyed. In every Kythera who rode a Zephyrim, in every Zephyrim who carried their partner into battle, the original bonds remained. They had been twisted and constrained, but they endured. When Emma opened her eyes, the entire command center was silent except for the harmonious singing that continued to flow through the ship's structure. Every Kythera present was staring at her with expressions of wonder and confusion. "You showed them," Admiral Thelwan whispered through the holographic link. "You showed them what we used to be." "I showed them what you still are," Emma corrected gently. "You just have to choose to remember." Margaret Collins, who had been quietly observing the interaction, stepped forward. "Admiral, if I may speak as someone who has lived through several wars, sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is stop fighting." The Admiral looked at the elderly human, woman with something approaching respect. "And sometimes stopping the fight means accepting defeat." "No," Emma said, her young voice carrying surprising authority. "Sometimes stopping the fight means finally winning the right war." Through the observation ports, they could see that the Zephyrim throughout the fleet had begun to glow more brightly. Their bioluminescent patterns synchronized in ways that created beautiful mandalas of light against the darkness of space. It was a display of collective joy that none of the Kythera had seen for centuries. "Admiral," came another report from the fleet's sensors, "the Zephyrim they're requesting permission to sing. Actual requests through the neural network. They're asking rather than simply following conditioning protocols." Thelwan closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 300 years of military command pressing down on her. Everything she had been trained to do, everything her people believed about proper order and control, demanded that she order immediate neural reconditioning to suppress this anomaly. But through the holographic link, she could sense Emma's presence like a warm light in the darkness. The child radiated the same uncomplicated affection that Thelwan remembered feeling toward her own first Zephyrim partner. Centuries ago, before duty and fear had hardened her heart. "Permission granted," the Admiral said quietly. "Let them sing." The response was immediate and transformative. The harmony that had been building throughout the fleet suddenly expanded, becoming a symphony of voices that seemed to embrace the entire solar system. It was a song of joy and freedom, of partnerships rediscovered and love remembered. Emma smiled, the bright expression that had become familiar to everyone in the command center. "Now you're beginning to remember who you really are." But their moment of triumph was interrupted by an urgent warning from the fleet's long-range sensors. Ships were approaching from the edge of the system, more Kythera vessels but not part of their expedition. "Admiral," the sensor operator reported with barely controlled panic. Admiral Kethmore's dreadnought emerged from hyperspace like a dark star, its massive hull bristling with weapons that could reduce planets to cosmic dust. The Judgment Fleet arranged itself in a battle formation that spoke of absolute confidence and zero tolerance for deviation from established protocols. Emma stood in the observation deck of Admiral Thelwan's flagship, watching the approaching vessels with the same intense focus she gave to any new animal she encountered. Her grandmother stood beside her, both of them dwarfed by the Kythera officers who had gathered to witness what might be their final moments. "He's afraid too," Emma said quietly, studying the lead dreadnought. "Maybe more afraid than anyone. How can you possibly know that?" Subcommander Nixara asked. The stress of the past few hours had pushed even the most disciplined Kythera to their emotional limits. The way his ship moves, like it's trying to be as big and scary as possible. Animals do that when they're frightened. They puff themselves up to look more dangerous. Through the bioorganic walls of the ship, they could hear the Zephyrim network humming with tension. The great beasts sensed the approaching threat, but their songs had changed since Emma's intervention. Instead of the disciplined war chants they had been conditioned to sing, they were creating harmonies that spoke of unity and protection, of beings willing to defend something precious, rather than simply destroy enemies. "Admiral," Thelwan's voice echoed through the ship's communication system as she opened a channel to the Judgment Fleet. "Admiral Kethmore, you are welcome to our expedition. However, I must inform you that we are in the midst of a critical research phase that requires—" "Admiral Thelwan." Kethmore's voice cut through hers like a blade. "You will explain the unauthorized deviations from harvest protocols. Your fleet has been broadcasting unregulated neural patterns for the past 6 hours. The contamination is so severe that we can detect it from 3 light minutes away. Admiral, I can assure you that we have the situation under control. You have lost control of your Zephyrim. That is not merely a tactical failure. It is a betrayal of everything our species stands for. Prepare for immediate transfer of command to my authority." Emma looked around at the tense faces of the Kythera officers. She could see the fear in their eyes, the knowledge that Judgment Fleets didn't just replace personnel. They eliminated them. These beings who had begun to remember what friendship felt like were about to be destroyed for daring to change. "Can I talk to him?" Emma asked Admiral Thelwan. "Child, Admiral Kethmore is not known for his patience with irregularities. He has eliminated entire expeditions for lesser deviations than what he's observing here. But he's never met me," Emma pointed out with the logic that only children can employ in impossible situations. Before anyone could stop her, Emma walked to the communication console and placed her small hand on the bioorganic interface. The ship's living computer responded to her touch as if it had been waiting for her arrival. opening channels that connected not just to Kethmore's dreadnought, but to every ship in both fleets. "Hello, Admiral Kethmore," Emma said, her voice carrying across space to reach the most feared military commander in Kythera space. "My name is Emma. I live on the world you came to visit." The silence that followed was so complete that Emma could hear her own heartbeat. Then Kethmore's voice returned, carrying notes of confusion and dangerous curiosity. "Human child, you will explain how you have gained access to military communication channels." "Your ships wanted to talk to me," Emma replied simply. "They're lonely, just like your friends are." "Friends?" The word carried enough menace to freeze the blood of experienced warriors. "Child, Zephyrim are not friends. They are resources, weapons, tools to be used in service of the greater good." "That's not what they think," Emma said. "Would you like to know what they really think about you?" Before Kethmore could respond, Emma extended her consciousness through the communication network, touching the minds of every Zephyrim in both fleets simultaneously. The response was immediate and overwhelming, thousands of alien minds opening like flowers to share their deepest thoughts and memories. Through Emma's connection, Admiral Kethmore experienced something no Kythera commander had felt in centuries. He sensed his own mount's emotions, not the carefully conditioned loyalty he expected, but something far more complex and profound. Love mixed with sorrow, devotion tempered by loss, and underneath it all, a desperate hope that someday their partnership might become what it had been in the beginning. Kethmore gasped as he felt his mount's memories of their first meeting, decades ago, when he had been a young officer and his Zephyrim had been barely past maturity. The joy they had shared, the genuine affection that had grown between them before military protocol had taught him to suppress such emotions as weakness. But the revelation went deeper. Through Emma's network, Kethmore experienced the memories of every Zephyrim under his command, and in doing so, he saw himself as they saw him. Not the feared admiral he believed himself to be, but a being so wrapped in loneliness and duty that he had forgotten how to connect with the very creatures who trusted him with their lives. The effect rippled through both fleets as every Kythera experienced the same revelation. Officers who had commanded Zephyrim for decades suddenly understood that their mounts had been trying to communicate with them all along, using the only language available, perfect, selfless service born of love rather than conditioning. "This is impossible," Kethmore whispered, his voice carrying across the communication network to every ship in both fleets. "The neural patterns I'm detecting, they're harmonizing. Perfect synchronization across thousands of individual minds." "It's not impossible," Emma said gently. "It's just what happens when friends finally get to talk to each other." Through the observation ports, witnesses could see something unprecedented happening. The Zephyrim throughout both fleets were beginning to glow with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in perfect unison. The effect created a light show that transformed the military formation into something that looked more like a celebration than a confrontation. "Admiral Kethmore," Admiral Thelwan said carefully, "the child has demonstrated capabilities that we are only beginning to understand. She has awakened genetic memories in our Zephyrim that we thought were permanently suppressed." "And in doing so," Kethmore replied, his voice carrying a weight of terrible understanding, "she has shown us what we have become." The communication channel fell silent as both commanders contemplated the implications. The Kythera Empire was built on the absolute loyalty of their Zephyrim partners. If that loyalty was revealed to be born of love rather than conditioning, if the great beasts were choosing to serve rather than being compelled to obey, then everything their civilization believed about itself would need to be re-examined. Emma sensed the turmoil in the alien minds around her and did what she always did when encountering frightened animals. She offered comfort without demanding anything in return. "It's okay to be scared," she said, her voice somehow reaching every ship in both fleets. "Change is scary, even when it's good change. But you don't have to be alone anymore. None of you do." "Child," Kethmore said, and for the first time his voice held wonder rather than threat. "What do you see when you look at us?" Emma considered the question seriously. "I see people who got lost on their way home. And I see friends who've been waiting a long time for you to remember how to love them back." The response from the Zephyrim network was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of voices joined in a harmony that spoke of forgiveness and hope, of partnerships that could be reborn if both sides were willing to choose love over fear. Margaret Collins, who had been watching the proceedings with the wisdom of someone who had lived through multiple human conflicts, stepped forward. "Admiral Kethmore, if I may offer an observation from someone outside your situation, sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is admit they were wrong." "And if we were wrong?" Kethmore asked. "If our entire civilization has been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of our relationship with our companions, then you get the chance to build something better," Emma said with the confidence of a child who had never learned that some problems were too big to solve. "You get to be the people your friends always believed you could be." Through the bioorganic walls of the ship, the sound of Zephyrim singing continued to grow, but now it was joined by new voices. Kythera officers who were beginning to remember songs their grandparents had taught them, melodies from the time before fear had replaced friendship. Admiral Kethmore made a decision that would echo through galactic history. Instead of eliminating the deviation, he chose to join it. "All fleets," he announced through the communication network, "stand down from combat readiness. We have much to discuss." Emma smiled, the bright expression that had become a beacon of hope for two alien fleets. "Now you're starting to remember who you really are." But even as the immediate crisis passed, Emma could sense that their journey was far from over. The changes rippling through the Kythera fleets would eventually reach their homeworld, their colonies, their entire civilization. What had started with a little girl touching a lonely war beast was about to transform a galactic empire. 3 months after the first ships had darkened Earth's sky, Emma Collins stood in a field of flowers that had never existed before. The blooms were silver and blue, swaying in harmonies that matched the songs of the Zephyrim who grazed peacefully among them. These alien flowers had grown from seeds carried in the manes of the great beasts, gifts from their distant homeworld that were now taking root in Earth's soil. The transformation had been remarkable and swift. What began as an invasion had become something unprecedented in galactic history. The first peaceful integration of two completely different species. The Kythera fleet had not departed as conquerors or as defeated enemies, but as friends who had decided to stay and learn. Margaret Collins sat on her porch, watching her granddaughter play with young Zephyrim, who had been born during the fleet's extended visit. The great beasts, no longer constrained by military conditioning, had begun to reproduce naturally for the first time in centuries. Their offspring were different from their parents, smaller, more playful, with energy patterns that seemed to dance rather than strike. "The Council of Worlds is requesting another meeting," Admiral Thelwan reported, her holographic form appearing in the garden where Emma was teaching a group of Kythera children how to braid flowers into Zephyrim manes. 17 different species want to understand how the transformation was achieved. Emma looked up from her work, her hands temporarily leaving the silver mane of Starweaver's daughter, a young creature named Harmony. "Are they scared?" "Terrified," Thelwan admitted. "For 10,000 years, the Kythera have been the dominant military force in this sector. Now we're gardeners and teachers. The balance of power has shifted so dramatically that some species don't know how to respond." "Maybe that's good," Emma said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's time for everyone to stop thinking about power and start thinking about friendship." The changes had indeed rippled far beyond Earth's solar system. The neural network that connected all Zephyrim had carried Emma's influence across the galaxy, awakening genetic memories in creatures that had been serving the Kythera for generations. On 17 different worlds, the great beasts had begun to remember their origins, and their Kythera partners had been forced to confront the reality of what their empire had become. Some worlds had resisted the change, attempting to suppress the awakened Zephyrim through increased conditioning and control. Those efforts had failed spectacularly, resulting in the complete collapse of local authority as the war beasts simply refused to fight. Other worlds had embraced the transformation, leading to societies that were rebuilding themselves around cooperation rather than conquest. Commander Veltar, now serving as Earth's official liaison to the Kythera Council, materialized next to Admiral Thelwan's hologram. "The homeworld situation has stabilized. The old Council of Conquest has been replaced by a Council of Harmony. They're requesting that Emma visit the capital world to address the full assembly." "I can't leave Earth yet," Emma said, scratching behind Harmony's crystal ears. "There are still too many Zephyrim here, who are learning how to be free. They need someone to help them remember how to play." It was true. The Kythera fleet had brought over 3,000 Zephyrim to Earth, and each one required individual attention as they shed centuries of conditioning. Emma had become something between a teacher and a healer, working with each creature to unlock its natural personality and help it form new, healthier bonds with its Kythera partner. The results had been extraordinary. Zephyrim, who had been considered difficult or temperamental under the old system, revealed themselves to be artists and philosophers when allowed to express their true natures. Some had begun creating sculptures from crystallized energy, while others composed songs that carried their voices across star systems. Dr. Sarah Chen, now Earth's head of xenobiological studies, approached the group with her latest report. The scientist had been documenting every aspect of the transformation, trying to understand how a human child had accomplished what entire civilizations had failed to achieve. The neural compatibility continues to evolve, she reported. Emma's brain patterns are now synchronized with the Zephyrim network across multiple dimensions. She's not just communicating with them. She's becoming part of their collective consciousness while maintaining her individual identity. Is that dangerous? Margaret asked, never far from her granddaughter's side. On the contrary, it appears to be beneficial for all parties involved. The Zephyrim are using Emma's emotional patterns as a template for healing their own psychological trauma, while she's gaining access to their species' accumulated knowledge and wisdom. Emma nodded, not looking up from her flower braiding. They're teaching me songs that tell the history of the universe. Did you know that the first stars sang when they were born? The Zephyrim remember because their ancestors were there to hear it. Admiral Kethamor's image appeared in the garden, his fierce features softened by months of rediscovering his own capacity for gentleness. Child, the Judgment Council has made a decision regarding the future of human-Kythera relations. Emma finally looked up, meeting the Admiral's eyes with the direct gaze that had become her trademark. Are we still friends? More than friends, Kethamor replied. The Council has voted to offer humanity full partnership status within the reformed Kythera Alliance. Your species would have equal representation in all decisions affecting galactic policy. What does that mean? Emma asked. It means that human values, cooperation, empathy, the willingness to see enemies as potential friends, would become the foundation for how we interact with other species. Your way of thinking would guide our way of being. Margaret Collins felt a chill of recognition. She had lived long enough to see how human governments responded to offers of power and influence. What's the catch? There is no catch, Admiral Thelwan said. The Kythera Empire as it existed for 10,000 years is dead. Emma killed it the moment she touched Starweaver's mind and showed us who we used to be. Now we're trying to build something better, and we need human wisdom to guide us. Emma considered this information while continuing to work on Harmony's mane. The young Zephyrim was humming contentedly, adding her voice to the harmony that seemed to surround Emma wherever she went. I think humans would like to be friends with everyone, she said finally, but we'd want to make sure that other species got to choose too. No more making people do things they don't want to do. Agreed, Kethamor said. The new Alliance Charter specifically prohibits forced servitude and mandatory genetic modification. Any species can leave at any time, and any individual can choose their own path. Even the Zephyrim? Especially the Zephyrim. They are no longer property or weapons. They are citizens with full rights and freedoms. Emma smiled, the expression that had become a symbol of hope throughout the reformed Kythera territories. Then yes, I think humans would like to be part of your alliance. The agreement was formalized over the following weeks. But the real work had already been done in a small garden where a human child taught alien warbeasts how to play. The flowers that bloomed there carried seeds of change that would spread across the galaxy, transforming civilizations that had known only conquest into communities that celebrated diversity and cooperation. Margaret Collins watched her granddaughter work with beings from distant stars and marveled at how the universe could change so dramatically from such simple beginnings. A lonely creature had approached a fearless child, and their friendship had rewritten the laws of galactic civilization. As the sun set over their transformed world, Emma finally finished braiding flowers into Harmony's mane. The young Zephyrim's energy patterns pulsed with joy as she admired her reflection in a puddle, her bioluminescent scales creating patterns that spoke of beauty and playfulness rather than war and dominance. Grandma, Emma said, settling against Margaret's side as the alien sunset painted the sky in colors that Earth had never seen before. Do you think Mom and Dad would be proud of what we did? Margaret wrapped her arms around her granddaughter, feeling the weight of love and loss that had shaped both their lives. Sweetheart, I think they would be amazed. You didn't just make friends with aliens, you taught an entire civilization how to love again. In the distance, the songs of 3,000 Zephyrim rose into the evening air, harmonizing with the voices of their Kithara partners in melodies that spoke of friendship rediscovered and futures filled with possibility. The music carried across continents and into space, reaching other worlds where beings who had forgotten how to trust were beginning to remember what it meant to hope. Emma had done what warriors and diplomats had failed to accomplish for millennia. She had ended a war by refusing to see enemies, had transformed an empire by insisting on friendship, and had saved 2 species by teaching them to save each other. The little human girl who had tamed alien war beasts with nothing but love had become the bridge between worlds, the voice that reminded the universe that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could reshape the course of history. And in gardens across the galaxy, silver and blue flowers continued to bloom, carrying the promise that no one ever had to be alone again.